This is Randall Root, and in this video we're going to take a look at how to create a SSAS dimension. In the previous video we created in the previous video we went ahead and created a data source and a data source view. Actually, I made several of them, but I've removed some of them. Let me adjust this a little bit here. So I'm just down to one data source view that referenced the data warehouse I had built based on the pubs demonstration database. Positioning doesn't make much difference. For SSAS, it doesn't care exactly where things line up, but for the video I'll go ahead and adjust it so we can actually get a picture of it all. If you haven't seen this database, you may just want to pause for a minute and the video and just take a look at the way it's laid out. A couple things to note is we have a fact table called fact sales and another one called fact title authors. Fact sales actually contains our measured values. The measure here is sales quantity. There's a relationship to a date table called dim dates, a relationship to the titles table called dim titles, and a relationship from the stores table called dim stores. Order number is also dimensional data, and you can see that I've actually placed a composite primary key against all four dimensional columns. And of course, on the measure there is no dimensional key, so it's just separate from the primary key. In addition to that, there are a couple of other satellite tables, if you would. Dim publishers, which represents the publishers of a given title, and dim authors, which represents the author of a particular title. Because there's a relationship of many to many between one author could write many title and one title could write many author or be written by many authors, I need this bridge table or fact table. Between dim publishers and dim titles, the relationship is simpler. It's just a one to many. One publisher can have many titles, but only one publisher is associated with a given title at a time. In addition to that, there is another relationship that wasn't picked up by the wizard, and that relationship is the published date. The published date key actually needs to relate to dim dates. Oh, I actually made a mistake here. I was looking at the relationship lines and I didn't see how this one was already tied in. I guess that's a problem. If I really want to adjust this, I could go ahead and move things around so that it was more obvious. In fact, it would probably be best if I put the fact table in the center. It's not that SSAS cares. It's just easier for the human to kind of spot things. Getting these arrows to look pretty is quite a challenge sometimes. Okay, I think I'll stop there because, again, it has no impact on the way it's programmed. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make some dimensions now based on this design. So we have a date dimension, we have a regular dimension based on stores and dim titles. We have the possibility of making a reference dimension against dim publishers, or we could go ahead and collapse dim publishers into dim titles and create just a single dimension. I'll talk a little bit about what the difference is in a later video. We have a many-to-many dimension up here for dim authors, and we actually have a fact or degenerate dimension in the form of order number. So several different dimensions are possible. In this video, we'll just take a look at a standard dimension. So to start that one, let's just pick on dim stores. That'll be the one we'll work with. To create a dimension against dim stores, we right-click on the dimensions icon in Solution Explorer and ask to make a new dimension. Like most things in Analysis Server, it launches a wizard, and we advance the wizard and choose an existing table as our option. Other choices include being able to go through and create a timetable back in the data warehouse, create a timetable on the analysis server, create a non-timetable on the data source based on an existing template that was either made by Microsoft or some coworker or something you downloaded off the internet. This is something that we may see in later videos, but it's not very likely you'll choose any of these options. Most of the time you'll just choose the very first one, which is an existing table in the data source view. It's important to note that you cannot select a existing table in your data source if it doesn't show up in the data source view. All dimensions are made off the data source view, not the underlying structure. Advancing the wizard takes you to this next screen, in which case you specify two very important things. You need to identify the key column and the name column. Of course, if you have more than one data source view, you can use the drop-down box at the top and choose which one you want to work with. And you also do need to choose which table you want to work with, in this case dim stores. But once those are selected, the key column and name column are very important. The key column represents the unique identifier that is computer friendly. In other words, it uses identifiers, such as numbers. Whereas the name column represents the human friendly information about that number. Store key, like the number 1, 2, or 3, is not very human friendly. And as such, we'd want to go ahead and choose like store name. That'd be much more useful to human beings. In most cases, you'll want to have a key column and name column on every dimensional attribute. One thing to note, that this will actually represent a single attribute in the dimension. I'll come back to that later, so you'll see what I mean. But let's go ahead and advance a wizard. On the next screen, you can see where the attribute names are identified as store key and possibly store ID, although that currently is grayed out. We're going to go ahead and choose store ID. If you want to rename the columns, you certainly can do so. For example, if I would like to rename store ID to not have a space in the middle, or if I want to have an uppercase D in store ID, I can do that here. Or I can do it later. For example, later on, we'll go through and change store key into something else. I'll leave that as it is right now just to show you how it can be done after the wizard's completed. Under attribute type, you can select various different identifiers, categories of that describe the attribute. In general, these don't really provide you much advantage. There are certain times, such as when you're working with a date dimension, that it's absolutely necessary to choose that. Perhaps absolutely necessary is a little bit of over-exaggeration, but certainly it would have an impact, such as when you're doing programming against the dimension. In other cases, most often, it won't have any impact at all, and as such, leaving it as regular as the attribute type is perfectly fine. We're pretty much done with this screen. Time to move on to the next one. Pretty short wizard, as you can see. Here we've got the last part, in which case I will typically take out the space in the name. That's just a personal preference, though. It doesn't have to be done that way. If you like the space in the name, that's fine. If you want to take off the dimension identifier, dim, you can do that here too. It doesn't really matter too much. It's just a personal preference. Once you've made your decision, go ahead and hit finish and you've made your new dimension. The dimensioning editing window allows you to identify and configure your attributes, identify and configure custom hierarchies, and identify and configure the tables that are being used through the data source view. In general, you typically work with the attributes pane on the left-hand side. Other tabs here at the top include the attribute relationships, translations, and browser. We'll look at these a little bit later on in more detail. For now, what we want to do is make sure that everything is actually working. So to do that, we will right-click on the dimension and ask it to process. Processing demands that the file is actually saved before the processing begins. So it will automatically save your work that you've made so far. The next step that I'll do is it will go through and build the file that contains your dimensional structure into a master file. This is called the build process. Finally, it'll go through and upload the master file to the analysis server database. This is called the deployment process. Finally, I said that twice. Ultimately, the processing actually begins. This is the processing process, I guess you would call it, in which case the data is transferred from the source data to the analysis server database. The little pop-up box here says server contents appears to be out of date. Would you like to build and deploy the project first? Well, if we want to process the data from the source to the analysis server database, the answer has to be yes. If for some reason it cannot build, or if for some reason it cannot be deployed, we will not be able to get to the processing step. At this point, I was unable to deploy. Now, I can tell that from experience. The building would have given me a different error message. But when it tries to deploy, it tries to take the master file, master code file that gets generated from all your other code files, such as the data source view, and dimension file, and upload to the server. If you don't have the correct credentials, you'll get a pop-up box asking for them. In my case, it's just as simple as putting in the correct password. A message screen shows me that deployment was successful, and the processing dialog window shows up. At the bottom, you'll see the Run button, and clicking on the Run button will start the processing, excuse me. When processing completes, you should get a window that will tell you the step-by-step details. You can even see the select statements that were being used to pull the data from the original database, data source, in this case it is the database, to the analysis server dimension. Once the dimension has been processed, you'll be able to go to the Browser tab, Click on the Browser tab and look at the resulting data. The store identifiers could be useful for looking up data in the original database. And although it doesn't provide us much information on a typical report, occasionally it might come in handy if you ever need to access information that was not included in the data warehouse. The store key, on the other hand, actually isn't a store key, but rather the store name. But that makes sense. This is exactly what the human is going to see. Remember that an attribute, such as this store key, is representing more than one underlying column. In fact, it represents two in this case. The first column is the key column. The second is the name column. There's even a value column that can be added, but it's seldom used. For the most part, what you want to focus on is the key column and the name column, which are the two that the wizards point out. All attributes can represent one or more, 1 to 3 columns of the underlying database. For example, the store ID attribute has a key column, but it currently doesn't have a name column or a value column. If these are not configured, then it just assumes that you want the same value or name as the key column. In other words, because we don't have a name column, we see the store ID. If you wish to explicitly indicate what should be displayed, such as saying the name column is the store ID, or even possibly the value column, but since that's seldom ever used in client applications, it's kind of immaterial, you can go ahead and explicitly set them. But it's not necessary. One other simple configuration we should take a look at is going through and modifying the name of the attribute to reflect what is being displayed. So, for example, the actual store key is its current name, when really it just represents the store. I could put store name, that would work, but putting store seems to make sense to me because it actually is indicating that this is information about the store, and programmers will kind of assume that there may be a key or name. If you're an MDX programmer, you kind of understand that represents that value. In later videos, we'll take a look at how to do MDX programming, and it'll make more sense at that point. So, to reiterate, there is 4 basic settings that you want to pay attention to when you're setting up a dimension. The key column, the name, let me change that. The name or name column, or should I say the name and name column, and quite possibly the type, although that not as much because for the most part it's going to be regular. I encourage people to set the key column, name column, and name on a regular basis and just verify that the type is set to either regular or if it's something like a date type. Boy, that star did not come out well. Go ahead and set that. Okay, that's how you set up a regular dimension. We'll need to take a look at some other features about dimensions in a later video, but at least that'll get you started. Thanks for watching.